How are you? Yeah, not bad. They're, separated just kind of the trees down there. Yeah, it should be a good handle. Hello, sir. How are you? Oh, okay. Oh, no. Oh, okay. Where's this going to be? I don't know what time they're shut. Normally on Thursday, votes are usually something. So, yeah, if the votes are after, yeah, I'm going to try and go in. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yeah, if we could. Yeah, if we could figure out some way to crazy information that's around healthcare, that, they don't get it, they don't understand how serious. You know, the shooting in here?
How are you? Good to see you again.
Judge,
Colonel, keep your seat.
how you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thank you.
No, that was unfair. There'd be bullet holes in it if we did that. No, no. Well, I hope so. Committees, blue ribbon committees, panels, give me a break. Come on, I'm trying to change my act. Hey, Ted, how you doing?
Great. How you doing, buddy?
Yeah, not too bad.
See you.
Me too.
Oh, you're turn your microphone off.
Oh,
Testing? Testing, all right.
Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Ranking Member Sherman is momentarily delayed. He will be here, and he will be recognized for his opening statement as soon as he arrives. I do want to thank everyone, especially the panelists, for waiting during the last series of votes. Appreciate your diligence, and also appreciate you being here. The crisis in Syria is a complicated mess. The poster in front here and once again on the screen outlines to some extent the situation. At the very top of the poster in yellow is the Kurdish intrusion into what is Syria. The red portions are where the opposition, the rebels, all the rebel groups, different groups in different areas, but the red is the opposition controlling certain areas of Syria. The green is controlled by Assad. The vast majority of the land that is in white, that is uninhabited areas of Syria. The butcher Assad has slaughtered countless innocent civilians and has used chemical weapons on his own people. Every day Syrians flee the country in thousands to escape the horror. Assad is supported by the Iranian regime and their Shia killers Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the main reason why Assad has remained in power. Without thousands of highly trained Hezbollah killers, it's possible that the regime would have been toppled by now. The IRGC and the Quds Force are actively propping up Assad to maintain Shia control of Syria and allow Iran to project its power across the region. Aside from Hezbollah and Assad's armed forces, there are irregular militias called Shabihus that are loyal death squads for the regime. On the other side, you have the Sunni fighters who range from so-called moderates to hardcore extremists with ties to Al-Qaeda. The worst of the lot is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, which is Al-Qaeda. ISIS works closely with Al-Qaeda in Iraq to create a safe haven from which they can conduct their reign of terror. ISIS numbers well into the thousands, and most of the foreign fighters who have come to Syria fight with ISIS. I'll repeat that. The foreign fighters that come are those that fight with ISIS. It isn't just the numbers that are important, it's what they are fighting for and how effective they are. ISIS is at the top of the pyramid. Then you have Jabhat al-Nusra, or JN, which is another jihadist group that shares Al-Qaeda's ideas and objectives. Neither of these groups, in my opinion, are moderates. Both fund their operations from Gulf country donations, kidnappings, protection rackets, muscling in on the oil trade, and other illegal means. Then there's another major Sunni group, is al-Sham, which many consider to be the strongest and most effective fighting force in several key cities. They may not be exactly Al-Qaeda, but they're not exactly good folks either. So the so-called moderates fight for the Supreme Military Command Council, or SMC. General Salam Idris is the leader of this group. If you recall, this is the same group that the State Department was saying that we should arm to topple Assad. These fighters were billed as moderates who would keep Al-Qaeda from taking over. But over the last several months, a large faction of the SMC has actually defected to the radical extremist. It's not even clear if the SMC actually has any control over its fighters on the ground. It's been said that these groups were never true secular nationalists, but Islamics from varying degrees. With so-called moderates fleeing into the arms of Al-Qaeda, it seems that conflict has become a war between radical Al-Qaeda-affiliated extremists and a brutal dictator. It's hard for me to see a clear winner and one that the United States can support. We don't want the Iranians to dominate in Syria with their now puppet Assad. We also don't want Al-Qaeda taking over the country and leaking Syria with Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq. Left with this impossible choice, it's hard to see how further U.S. involvement can change the situation for the better. The regional implications of this conflict are important to understand, and that's why we are here today. It's a possibility that Assad could be removed and then the rebel forces commit civil war against each other to see who is going to control the country. That is yet to be determined. Massive refugee flows are destabilizing our allies in the region and threaten to overwhelm large portions of their countries. I was recently in Turkey and on the Syrian border with Turkey and visited a refugee camp of over 150,000 Syrians who had fled the war and now are in Turkey. Refugees are in numerous countries around the area. The fear of chemical weapons proliferation to terrorist groups is a possibility despite weapons inspectors trying to secure as many as they can. Radical foreign fighters who come to Syria to fight will eventually return home and may be motivated to launch attacks at the urging of al-Qaeda. We also know there are U.S. citizens who have traveled to Syria for jihad. We need to be on top of their travels and intentions so they don't come back and attack the United States. It is important for us to understand these groups that are active in Syria so we know not only who we are dealing with, but what they plan to do and achieve in their objectives. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. I now turn over to my ranking member, Mr. Sherman from California, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding these hearings. The scale of violence in Syria is well known to all of us. 120,000 people have died. Iran and Hezbollah are providing money, men, and munitions to the brutal Assad regime. 2 explosions near the Iranian embassy in Beirut appear to have killed 23 people, including the Iranian cultural attaché to Lebanon. A Sunni jihadist group said it was behind the attack, and this, of course, is not the first time that Sunni jihadists have carried out deadly attacks inside Hezbollah-controlled areas in Lebanon. The bombing serves as an indicator of a major spillover from the Syrian conflict into Lebanon, and we don't have to be reminded what an ethnic and religious tinderbox Lebanon was from 1975 to 1990. There are no excellent options involving Syria. Only the weaker part of the opposition shares with us a dedication to democracy, human rights, or even a pale imitation thereof. But as reprehensible as some of the Sunni jihadists are, it is the Assad-Hezbollah-Tehran axis which is a greater threat to the United States and our interests than even the worst elements. I would say even the al-Qaeda elements of the opposition, though trying to choose from between very bad actors is certainly not something we prefer to do. In March of 2013, I joined with the ranking member of the full committee, Elliot Engel, and with House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence Chairman Mike Rogers in introducing the Free Syria Act, which would authorize and direct the President to provide appropriate assistance, including limited lethal equipment, to carefully vetted Syrian opposition members. Clearly, the number and organization and power of the good forces in Syria has declined vis-a-vis both the Assad regime and the Sunni jihadists. Yet I still think that working with the reasonable elements of the opposition is the best of the bad choices available to us. We see Jabhat al-Nusra, the ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and the rapidly growing Shar al-Sham, or Free Men of the Levant, growing in power in Syria. We know that at least 2 of those groups have pledged their allegiance to Al-Qaeda Central, or perhaps we should call it Al-Qaeda the franchisor. And the moderate rebel group, the Free Syrian Army, has been losing fighters and capacities to the hardcore extremists. If we have to reflect on how brutal those extremists are, we can see that a video that apparently they posted on YouTube showing themselves killing truck drivers in Iraq simply because these gentlemen were Alawites and were unable to successfully pretend to be Sunnis. The al-Qaeda-affiliated groups have brought bomb-making and other war-fighting capacities to the Syrian civil war. They've recruited young men into their ranks, and they're instilling extremist views. The Saudis and others of our friends in the Gulf are deeply frustrated over the administration's lack of ample lethal aid, even non-lethal aid to the Syrian rebels. But our friends in the Gulf are a little less concerned about dedication to human rights or even to peace between nations when they decide which groups in Syria to support. Tens of thousands of Hezbollah members fight along Assad, all with the support of an Iranian government, and all with the Iraqi government that we created allowing planes to go over its territory carrying IRGC to Damascus. I could go on, but I should yield back, and I do.
Thank the ranking member. Are there other members that wish to be recognized for opening statements? The chair will recognize the vice chair of this committee, Mr. Kinzinger, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses who've come in today. The ongoing conflict in Syria has rapidly evolved into a historic holy war between Sunnis and Shiites. This has left us with an atrocity of well over 115,000 dead and a conservative estimate of 2.24 million refugees and IDPs. I supported President Obama earlier this year and limited U.S. military strikes as a punishment for chemical weapons use. But in solving the larger crisis, the simple fact is we've waited too long. We've waited too long to exert U.S. influence in the region, thus creating a power vacuum and leaving open the door for Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia to fill this void, all groups that I certainly do not want to exert more influence in the Middle East. I'm not fully sure what the answer is, and I look forward to hearing what the panel suggests. But what I do know is if the U.S. continues to sit on the sidelines and present ourselves as an unreliable partner in the Middle East, we'll lose significant influence in the region and the world. I look forward to the testimonies of the witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'll introduce the witnesses at this time. We have several good witnesses for us today. Mr. Brian Michael Jenkins is a senior advisor to the president of the RAND Corporation, author of numerous books, reports, and articles on terrorism-related topics. He's formerly served as chair of the political science department at RAND. Philip Smythe is a Middle East analyst at the University of Maryland's Laboratory for Cultural Dynamics, where he focuses on Lebanese, Hezbollah, and other regional Iranian Shia proxies. He was formerly an American-based research fellow at the Gloria Center. Mr. Barak Barfi is a research fellow at the New America Foundation, where he specializes in Arab and Islamic affairs. Previously, Barak was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Andrew Tabler is a senior fellow in the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute, where he focuses on Syria and U.S. policy in the Levant. During 14 years of residence in the Middle East, Mr. Tabler served most recently as a consultant on U.S.-Syria relations for the International Crisis Group and a fellow at the Institute of Current World Affairs. Without objection, all the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record. I ask that each witness keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. There is a clock in front of you somewhere. When you see the yellow light come on, that tells you have 1 minute, and the red means your 5 minutes are up. I will start with Mr. Jenkins.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. Let me start with the assertion that, other than as a scrap of color on a map, Syria has ceased to exist. For the foreseeable future, no government will be able to rule the entire country. With the support from Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, Syrian government forces appear to have stalemated a fragmented rebel movement. Rebel forces do control large areas of the country where government forces have withdrawn, but even if Assad falls, they too will be unable to impose their authority throughout Syria. Moreover, as you pointed out in your opening statements, the growing role of jihadist elements has divided the rebel movement and discouraged Western governments from providing the rebels with significant military support. It's against this background that the committee has asked me to address the role of Sunni and Shia terrorism. On the Sunni side, Syria represents al-Qaeda's best chance of establishing a new base in the Middle East from which to continue its terrorist campaign against the West. Two groups are directly linked to al-Qaeda, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL or ISIS, using the term Sham instead of the Levant, and Jabhat al-Nusra. Through its ferocity on the battlefield and dramatic suicide bombings, al-Nusra has attracted financial support and recruits to become what many regard as the most effective rebel force. ISIS or ISIL is simply the latest incarnation of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which emerged after the American invasion. Since the American withdrawal, the group has continued its terrorist campaign in Iraq while expanding its area of operations to include Syria. I should point out here just briefly that Sham, the last word in the title, implies something much broader than modern-day Syria. This is something that encompasses Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and of course Israel. So this is a much broader assertion of a theater. The rebel forces have attracted between 6,000 and 8,000 foreign fighters. Most of them come from Arab countries, but an estimated 500 or so come from Western countries. These numbers will increase as the fighting continues. Europe especially is worried that about what may happen when these fighters return home, possibly to engage in terrorist activities. It's not an immediate problem, as the flow right now of recruits is toward Syria, not the other way. However, arriving volunteers could be recruited by al-Qaeda operatives to carry out terrorist operations in the West. We have to recall that Mohammed Atta originally came to fight in Afghanistan, but was then recruited by al-Qaeda and turned around to lead the 9/11 operation. Insofar as we know, comparatively few of these foreign fighters have come from the United States. Some have, but the chatter on the social media certainly indicate aspirations for others to go. Hezbollah represents the Shia side of terrorism, although Hezbollah's forces in Syria are fighting a more conventional war, bolstering a regime that's worried about the loyalty of its Sunni troops. Hezbollah is also training the militias that will bear an increasing portion of the fighting, in my view. Terrorism certainly will be a growing feature of the Syrian conflict. The rebels are able to take smaller towns, infiltrate larger cities, and can carry out spectacular terrorist attacks, but as these enclaves are consolidated, as what we might refer to as the front lines become harder, terrorism will become the rebels' principal weapon. On the other side, the Syrian government's approach to counterinsurgency is essentially a strategy of terror. It's marked by intensive aerial and artillery bombardment, razing entire neighborhoods and towns, deliberately targeting the civilian population in the rebel zones. This style of fighting serves the dual purpose of terrorizing supporters of the rebels while binding Assad's forces to the regime. Local militias are now probably Syria's best weapons of mass destruction. Backed by the conventional forces of the Syrian armed forces, they root out rebel fighters and they carry out ethnic cleansing. As national institutions are worn away by the continuing conflict, the militias are going to become the primary protectors of the regime's enclaves. This has implications for any future foreign military intervention. You mentioned the refugees. About a third of Syria's population has either fled the country or has been displaced internally. According to UN estimates, by the end of 2014, more than half of Syria's population will be living as refugees, a situation conducive to future terrorism. So what began as a rebellion against the regime of Bashar al-Assad has become a sectarian war that has exacerbated sectarian tensions in Iraq, in Lebanon as well as in Syria, and increases the likelihood of a wider regional conflict that will affect diaspora communities as well. One way or another, we'll be dealing with the effluent of Syria's conflict for decades. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Smythe, Chair recognizes you for 5 minutes.
Chairman Poe and Ranking Minority Member Sherman, thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak to the subcommittee. As Syria continues to burn and the United States attempts to both assess its interests and protect our existing interests, there's a major player in its proxies which are often misunderstood and also receive less attention. In early March 2013, British Foreign Minister William Hague said, and I quote, "Syria today has become the top destination for jihadists." The jihadists he was referring to were Sunni Islamists fighting as part of a number of Syrian rebel groups. However, an often overlooked, growing, well-organized, and highly militarily capable jihadist element within Syria is not only pro-Assad, but it's also Shia Islamist in nature, in addition to being backed and run by Iran. Shia jihadis, their movements, and the narratives they utilize are highly developed and form part of a larger Iranian regional strategy. Tehran's main regional proxies, which believe in, promote, and project Iran's quote-unquote Islamic revolutionary ideology, are the main contributors of Shia fighters to Syria. The proxy groups sending combatants include Lebanese Hezbollah, Iraq's Asayib al-Haq, the Badr Organization, Kataib Hezbollah, and smaller Iranian-backed splinters from Iraqi Shia radical leader Muqtada al-Sadr. Announcing its existence in May, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, this is another Iraq-based Iranian client organization, claims to have sent some 500 fighters to Syria, and they're quite brutal. Starting in mid-October, Asayib al-Haq publicly called for Iraqi Shia volunteers to join the organization's fight in Syria. For months prior, there had also been reports of trained volunteer fighters who had joined Kataib Hezbollah and Asayib al-Haq, and they were then trained in Iran or Lebanon in Hezbollah's training camps, and were then flown to Syria. Some of the combatants have included Shia from as far afield as Saudi Arabia, Cote d'Ivoire, and even Afghanistan. These Shia elements have constituted a key element which has secured and provided a powerful kinetic force to keep the Assad regime in power. According to one Lebanese Hezbollah fighter who was interviewed by Time magazine, this is a great quote, "If we don't defend the Syrian regime, it would fall within 2 hours." Without the initial push by Iran and the utilization of its proxy network, Shia armed involvement via the deployment of volunteer fighters and trained assets would have likely constituted a very limited effect on the battlefield. It's also probable that without Iran's regional network of Shia Islamist fighters, the Assad regime would have been unable to mount any of its most recent offensives. And now, all of these factors are contributing to a hyper-sectarianization of the conflict. To quote an Asayib al-Haq singer, yes, they have propaganda singers, and his name's Ali Delphi, "We're not simply fighting for Bashar, we fight for Shiism." Thank you.
Mr. Barfi for 5 minutes, please.
Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today about the various jihadist groups operating in Syria. Before I begin, I just want to give a quick shout out to my advisor, Professor Richard Bullitt at Columbia, who taught me all the nuances of Islam that Philip has just reviewed with me. Syria has emerged as the #1 destination of foreign jihadists. Pipelines from the Arabian Peninsula, Europe, and North Africa funnel fighters to Syria. Some of these fighters have allied with homegrown extremists to create the Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate known as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. Today, ISIS is the strongest brigade in Syria with a robust presence in many of the country's provinces. However, although media attention is largely focused on ISIS, there are a number of other Salafist and jihadist brigades, organizations that espouse an anti-modern and anti-Western message that are active in Syria. ISIS's roots date back to January 2012 creation of Jabhat al-Nusra, or JN, when al-Qaeda's Iraqi affiliate, the Islamic State in Iraq, or ISI, sought to exploit the Syrian revolution and establish a regional branch there. On April 8, 2013, ISI's leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, announced that JN had been absorbed into ISI to become ISIS. JN's leader rebuffed the merger and received the support of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. Nevertheless, within days, many JN's fighters defected to ISIS. ISIS also took over a number of JN's compounds. Moderate members deserted for the rebel-led Free Syrian Army, or FSA. It appeared that JN was on the brink of disintegration. But shedding outliers who inflamed internal dissent led to a more unified membership and a more cohesive ideology. The issue of takfirism, or declaring a Muslim an infidel, was bitterly contested within JN. The leadership was never comfortable with the extremists who advocated it and were pleased that they jumped ship to ISIS. In addition, most of the radicals who left were foreign fighters, allowing JN to present itself as authentically Syrian. Tensions between ISIS and JN are illustrated by the events in the city of Raqqa. After the April merger, JN's leader, Abu Saad, decided not to join ISIS. Instead, he abandoned JN's compound with about 30, that's now under ISIS control, with about 30 fighters. After keeping a low profile for several months, as it reorganized, JN reemerged in September. In the interim, it absorbed units from the rebel-led Free Syrian Army who felt threatened by ISIS's consolidation of power. A number of units from the 11th Division, such as Thawar Raqqa and Muntasir bil-Allah, joined JN. But JN's comeback vexed ISIS, which responded by incarcerating the former leader Abu Saad. In other areas, such as Aleppo, ISIS members have defected back to JN. Other factors have brought the intra-Al-Qaeda conflict to the fore. On November 8th, al-Zawahiri announced the disbanding of ISIS, restricting al-Baghdadi's theater to Iraq and appointing JN as al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate. Given ISIS's independence from al-Qaeda's Pakistan-based leadership and its autonomous financial resources, al-Baghdadi has no need to accept al-Zawahiri's diktats. He has previously rebuffed al-Zawahiri Syrian directives and is likely to do so again. As smaller brigades such as Asafat al-Shamal and Ghulba al-Sham are squeezed out of the revolution by their larger counterparts, it is likely that rebel groups will consolidate into pro-ISIS and anti-ISIS groups. The anti-ISIS blocs will probably in the future be led by organizations such as JN. Such mergers portend a future battle where JN will play an important role as the bulwark against ISIS expansion. ISIS is able to act with impunity because of its predominance in the Syrian arena. It has a qualitative superiority over FSA units. Foreign jihadists brought with them skills learned in other conflicts. In addition, its ideological dedication to the revolution, often lacking in other FSA brigades, reflects the commitment that is admired by Syrians of all stripes. It is not only the organization's martial prowess that assures its popularity. In a war that has devastated state institutions, Syrians have few options for judicial arbitration. Because ISIS's leaders are mainly foreign, they can portray themselves as neutral mediators. The organization also provides municipal and social services, such as supplying grain to bakeries and establishing schools and summer camps. Local circumstances often dictate its relationship with the civilian community. In areas where corrupt FSA units or inefficient administrators operated prior to its arrival, ISIS has been welcomed. But in regions where local officials have created a modicum of government, ISIS has received poor grades. ISIS seeks to create an Islamic state guided by the harshest interpretations of Islamic law that have little grounding in Islamic history. The organization has declared that its struggle will not end with the toppling of the Syrian regime. It plans to take the fight to other Arab countries in its quest to create a nebulous caliphate. ISIS cooperates with many FSA and Islamist brigades. They sponsor joint operations and divide the spoils between them. But the organization has also clashed with other rebel groups. When ISIS sought to consolidate its control over Raqqa, it dispatched a suicide bomber to destroy a compound of the FSA unit Ahfad al-Rasul. In July, ISIS killed Kamal Hamami, a senior FSA leader in Latakia. His death sparked FSA promises of military riposte that never materialized. Indeed, various FSA units often boast they will take on ISIS, only to back down later. In sub-provinces such as Raqqa, the FSA is no longer in a position to challenge it. and others such as
Gentleman's
liberal.
time has expired. We do have your entire statement. Thank you, Mr. Barfy. And Mr. Tabler, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sherman, and to my fellow panelists. Thanks for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today. I've been asked to focus my testimony on U.S. national security interests in the region affected by the Syria conflict, what it means for Syria's neighbors, and regional implications. I'll be as brief as I can on such a three very important questions. I've been working on Syria for about 13 years, including living in the country for about 7. So to put the current situation in perspective, historically, Syria's primary importance to the United States is based on its role as the keystone in the post-Ottoman Middle East state architecture. Many, if not most of you, remember the 15-year Lebanon War, where civil strife spawned civil war, terrorism, and the destruction of the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, whose 241 killed marked the single largest day death toll for the Marine Corps since the Battle of Iwo Jima. The Lebanon War was horrible, but strategically and metaphorically, and I don't mean to belittle it, Lebanon was just the small row house on the end of a block of states carved out of the Ottoman Empire by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was hard for the fighting and the sectarianism to spread, most notably because the forces of the two neighboring row houses, Israel and a demographically different and more stable Syria under Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez, that intervened to stop and contain the sectarian nature of the conflict. Syria, in comparison, is the big row house in the middle of the block. And while the United States does not have historic interests in Syria and spent many years on opposite sides during the Cold War and the war on terrorism, almost all of Syria's neighbors are strategic U.S. allies: Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Lebanon, which is not allied with the United States, but where Washington has considerable interests and challenges. What that effectively means is that what happens in Syria is not going to stay there, and it's difficult to contain. What happened in Lebanon during the 70s and 80s is also occurring in Syria, a similar conflict, but it's happening much faster and on different levels. Regional sectarian rivalries are competing in Syria's bloody fight, with the vanguard forces coming from the laundry list of U.S. designated foreign terrorist organizations. Today, Hezbollah, IRGC Quds Force, and other Iranian-backed Shia militias fight alongside the Assad regime in the West. Salafists and jihadists, some of whom are al-Qaeda affiliates, fight alongside and often against, these days at least, the Syrian Sunni-dominated opposition. And in Kurdish areas, the Democratic Union Party, the PYD, an organization closely affiliated with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, otherwise known as the PKK, is now dominant. In a policy sense, the Syrian Arab Republic, which was a founding member of the 1979 list of state sponsors of terrorism, has devolved into 3 Syrias in which U.S.-designated terrorist organizations are not only present, but ascendant. As a result, U.S. national security interests affected by the Syria conflict are growing in number and in scale. This is not going to go away anytime soon, and is going to be an issue for U.S. foreign policymakers, and could also be an issue on the domestic scene, depending on which way the Syrian conflict goes and the threats that come out of it. Those that I can identify, and this list is not, I don't claim to speak absolute truth on this, but I've identified 5 general areas. One, first, concerns stability of key U.S. Middle East allies. Thus far, Syrian refugees and cross-border fighting have been the primary security threats to Israel, Jordan, Turkey, as well as Lebanon, with up to half the Syrian population on the move, or a third. Estimates here depend. Those who are taking shelter either inside of Syria or in neighboring countries, these areas become breeding grounds for terrorist groups that oppose not only their host countries, but the United States as well. Counterterrorism, both sides in the Syria conflict have moved to extremes over the last year, as my fellow panelists have outlined. There is now what I call a convergence of threats in Syria, with direct Iranian influence via terrorist groups at an all-time high, and the Levant as a whole, and al-Qaeda affiliates also spreading among the opposition. It seems likely that Syria will devolve into a number of what are increasingly described as ungoverned spaces, from which U.S.-designated terrorist organizations could launch operations in Syria, but across the globe. There's also energy security as well. The nature of the Syrian conflict is increasingly sectarian, fueled by both sides, and with the generally Shia forces supported by Iran and the Sunni forces supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. As this conflict gets more sectarian, eats down into the sectarian nature of Syrian society in the region, that would also have a knock-on effect with concerning the price of oil. The price of oil is not set by source, ladies and gentlemen. It's a world commodity, and it's set by overall risk in the world to the supplies. There's also a large threat to nonproliferation concerning chemical weapons, which have been addressed via the recent agreement between Russia and the United Nations and the United States on its destruction. And of course, we have the humanitarian concerns and the health concerns with a major outbreak of polio occurring in the middle of the country. I'll just conclude. There are a number of other recommendations in the written testimony. What I can say to you in brief is that while the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is recently agreed, has seemed to have addressed that aspect of the threat emerging from Syria, on the other issues that I outlined, it seems as if we're just kicking the can down the road, and that, as I think my fellow panelists have outlined, the threats emerging out of Syria will continue for the foreseeable future, with no easy solutions for the United States or our allies. Thank you.
Thank all the panelists for their statements. We'll begin the questions. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Play the scenario out hypothetically, if you can. And I know it's a hypothetical and it's based on your expertise, but down the road, as Mr. Tabler says, it's going to be eventually somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. You got two terrorist groups on each side. Entire region is unstable because of what's taking place in Syria. So, assume Assad wins and is able to run the rebels out. How does that play out? Assume he loses, the rebel groups take over. Is there civil war? Just kind of look into the future if you can for me. And I'll ask that question to all four of you. Mr. Jenkins?
It's a great question. I don't see one side prevailing in this conflict. I mean, in terms of, as I say, even if Assad were to fall, the fighting were to continue. Assad's growing power is not going to be able to, in the foreseeable future, reassert his authority throughout the country. And so I think the premise has to be one of continuing conflict among a kaleidoscope of ethnic and sectarian groups in Syria that could go on for many, many years, and that's really the premise. In that kind of a scenario, the United States, without significant investment, is really at the margin. And so the question becomes not one of whether we can back Assad or back the rebels against him, but rather what can we do within that kind of environment to meet the objectives that Mr. Tabler has identified in the country. What can we do to best serve our interest in a continuing conflict? And even raise the broader question, although it may sound cynical, is there I know we naturally as Americans want to get to post-war on this, but given the nature of the conflict, can we get there? And is it absolutely vital to U.S. interest that we try to end the fighting in Syria, or we simply accept that it will continue and try to contain it and as I say, live with this thing as it is, as these jihadists and Hezbollah and others tear each other up inside of the country once known as Syria?
Thank you. I'm going to change the question because I'm running out of time. Try to make your answers shorter if you can. Terrorist groups and their influence in neighboring countries, whether it's the Assad regime or the rebel groups, their effect on neighbors, Jordan, Lebanon, and even Israel. So, Mr. Smythe, I'll just ask you that question. How do you see that? What's taking place? What's the direction of those groups?
the direction, in particular, if you want to focus on the Iranian-backed organizations, they're becoming an extremely professional force, and they're very, very tough. We now have units that could, directly attack Israeli interests, American interests, Saudi interests, and they're building their power up in Syria. This is kind of like their training ground in many ways. In fact, Lebanese Hezbollah was sending its reserve troops into Syria so that they could essentially train and gain combat skills. And where do you think they're going to send them afterwards? They're likely going to send them to South Lebanon. That's usually where they put more of their trained men. Often they send them other places to create new Iranian proxy organizations. In terms of these other groups, Salafi jihadi groups, Sunni organizations, they too are gaining valuable combat experience. And since, both, it's interesting kind of trying to outline this. Iran has its own Islamic revolutionary ideology, and it is a global ideology. They really do, believe in this kind of messianic future. The same thing goes for these Sunni jihadists, and they're all trying to get to that end. You now have two radical forms of Islamism fighting each other, and this doesn't mean necessarily that they are going to stop fighting Western interests or any of their other enemies in the area.
All right, my time has expired. I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Sherman from California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Judge. And for those who would take delight in the fact that Sunni extremists who hate America are killing Shiite extremists who hate America, we have to reflect on the fact that they're both learning how to kill. We've got, it used to be even a question whether the Alawites were really part of the Shiite movement. They're certainly not the 12er Shiites that dominate Iran. Is there, and there are many different subgroups within the Sunni community. What we're seeing now is, in effect, a region-wide, from Iran to Syria, battle between Shiites and Sunnis. Have each group coalesced efficiently so that the different flavors of Sunnis all cooperate, notwithstanding theological differences, and Alawites and 12er Shiites and other Shiite-inspired but theologically different organizations coalesce? Do we see a coming together of two sides?
So when we look at the Alawis, Alawism starts in the 10th century. It's basically an offshoot of the 11th Shi'i Imam, and they're what's known as Ghulu, or they're very extreme in their dedication to Ali, to the point where becomes a god or a deity. They were outside the pale of Shiism for centuries. Both the Sunnis considered them infidels. To the 19th century, they were seen as like worse than the Jews and Christians. They couldn't give testimony in courts in Syria. The Shia had no relationship with them historically. It starts to change in the early 20th century under French and Turkish influence. That doesn't really go anywhere because they tried to impose the Jafri or 12er school of law. Later, some Alawi scholars go to Iran and Iraq, and they bring back books and some scholars. That made a little bit more progress. But the Alawis don't pray in mosques. They're antinomian, which means they don't abide by any of the precepts of Islam: fasting during Ramadan, 5 prayers, abstaining from the drinking alcohol. So there's a.
You're saying the Alawis drink alcohol, don't fast during Ramadan,
Yes.
and don't do all of the various things that some of us associate with Islam, and yet there seems to be a very solid bond. One of your other witnesses talks about how someone says, I'm not dying for Assad, I'm dying for Shiitism. I'm sure that was an Alawite who is now ready to die for Shiitism. Have the Alawites and the 12er and other Shiites come together? Mr. Smith?
Well, first of all, that singer is actually an Iraqi Shia. He sings for Asai Bahlul. So that's, you know, a special group that the
Okay.
Iranians created. However, I mean, you're hitting on something very, very important. Iran is trying to coalesce Shia as a whole, especially 12 or Shia, behind the Iranian mantle. We are your protectors. This is the message that's
Yeah, they protect 12 Shiites. They now seem to be protecting a group that generations ago they might not have accepted as even being Muslim. But I do want to move on to another question. Who's financing the Shiite, the Sunni extremists in Syria? Does that money come from well-connected people in Saudi Arabia? And do the Saudis happen to know that Al-Qaeda likes blowing up things associated with the royal family? Mr. Jenkins.
The support, I mean, for the groups that are not the hardcore Al-Qaeda groups that we've identified, certainly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the other Gulf monarchies are providing support to those groups. For those that have been identified as Al-Qaeda linked, it appears to be that their funding is coming from private donations, primarily in the Gulf monarchies.
And these private citizens, they're not the salt of the earth. They're very rich individuals who are well connected and are allowed to do this.
They are wealthy individuals, and there's a curious relationship in which a number of these rebel groups, in a sense, emerged during the rebellion, declared themselves on social media in order to seek foreign patrons, a little bit like football teams in a sense, except you create the team first and you look for a wealthy backer. And then you brag about your numbers and your exploits in order to keep that flow of support coming. So there's a lot of that taking place, and it's out of extremely
So there
wealthy
are
individuals.
people in Syria who would want to kill us who are financed by well-connected folks in the Gulf, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Vice Chair, Mr. Kinzinger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you all for being here. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there's no really good answers here, and I think it was well said that when the chairman asked to game out both options, rebels win or Assad wins, what does it look like? And the answer is, well, there's always going to be lawlessness in Syria. This is, in essence, Afghanistan pre-9/11 now, and so I think it's difficult. But let me, with that said, I want to pose to each of you the question of, again, I've been critical of the administration and saying we should have been out there more. We should have been engaged early when this was a handleable situation. But we are where we are today, and unfortunately, I haven't found the time machine yet. If I do, you'll know about it because I'll go back. Maybe we never even talk about it then. But I'll start with you, Mr. Tabler. If you want to just talk about it briefly, what's the U.S.'s option here, and how should we be more involved in order to see an outcome? And again, whether it's Assad stays or Assad goes, how can we have a more peaceful outcome with U.S. involvement? I want to hear your thoughts on this.
A very good question. There are various methods. It would depend. We have so many policy objectives running at the same time in Syria now. It would be very hard to achieve them all. Since the summer of 2011, August of 2011 to be specific, the position of the United States is that Assad should step aside and lead to a transitional governing body, which is outlined in the Geneva Accord of June 2012. But
I think it's safe to say, too, that was before we had an intense amount of extremist groups.
That's right. And so what's happened over time is that the ability to pursue those ends via state means has gone down. It was one of the downsides of a hands-off, lead from behind policy, as has been described, or the light footprint. There are several definitions for this, and I'm not claiming to know which one it is. So what's happened over time is that as the conflict has morphed and grown in scale, and the state has been destroyed, and I think Mr. Jenkins outlined that, and the other panelists as well. The question is, how do you then confront this convergence of threats that are coming out of Syria, both on the Iranian side and on the overall Sunni side, and the extremist nature of the fight? There are two primary areas. One is through direct intervention, and that was most recently debated concerning the Assad regime's use, according to U.S. intelligence estimates, of sarin gas inside of Syria. The president did not go down that road, and that would have been a limited strike. Those kind of options are still on the table, and the White House continues to say that they're on the table. I don't know anybody that fully sees how that might play out anytime soon, but we simply don't know. The other way to arrest this, in the case of the CW incident, it was concerning the regime. Going forward, you could launch drone strikes or other kinds of direct strikes on various terrorist groups. It's possible. Usually not done without the permission of the state itself, and I don't think the Assad regime would appreciate us bombing their associated forces. They might prefer if we bomb the rebels. Then there is indirect intervention, and indirect intervention involves, essentially like in Iraq, the Sahwa. It involves working with politically and militarily with groups on the ground to peel them away from the extremists. It's a much more slower, much more intelligent, and sometimes precise way of defeating terrorists. The problem with that is it's very difficult to have a hands-off, lead from behind, late footprint policy, and to do that covertly.
Well, and I think just to tag on, it's basically the U.S. has to get more involved, or the U.S. has to accept the chaos that's going to follow.
Right. It would be hard to see how the situation in Syria gets better towards our interests without more American involvement. The question is, what is the degree of that involvement? And that's where, until now, it's still, hotly debated. But what we can definitely say is that what we're doing until now is not working in terms of pursuing our interests, whether they're getting Assad to step aside, or to undermine extremism in the region, or a lot of other issues that we pursue in the region as a whole. So the question is what to do next.
I don't think anybody really knows what our policy is right now.
There is extreme confusion, even among those of us that have followed this for a long time, and even those that have contact with the administration, about how the administration would pursue and achieve its conflicting goals. That's true.
And there's a lot of confusion among our allies as well, which is just as disheartening.
And anger.
Yeah. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you. Right on time, too.
Thank the gentleman for watching the clock. The chair recognizes the other gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. Mr. Barfi, I want to start with you. Do you have a sense of how many organizations or groups are inside Syria fighting either on the side of the regime or against the regime? Ballpark number?
There's hundreds of units and brigades. Some of them, such as Lil Tawhid, is a very big brigade composed of different units numbering in the thousands. They're based in a province such as Aleppo. Then you have a Salafist brigade like Ahrar al-Sham. They are in several provinces, and we're talking 10, 15, 20,000 fighters, very strong. And then you have smaller groups like Amr bin al-As, which has a couple hundred fighters. But what's happening is it's a Pac-Man approach. Those larger brigades are slowly eating up the smaller brigades.
So this summer I read a report that there were as many as 1,200 different groups fighting inside Syria. Has that number decreased at this point, expanded, or stayed fairly constant?
You would think that there's going to be a decrease as you have mergers and integrations. However, you're also seeing the emergence of new groups like Katibat al-Nur in Aleppo. It's created by intellectuals and financed by businessmen because they thought that the FSA was giving the revolution a bad name.
Is a sense, I heard someone else use this context, the fighters coming in from the outside, this gentleman described as fierce, and they're there to fight to the death and either even continue fighting after any negotiated agreement that might be possible, whereas I would imagine businessmen coming together are not going to have the same fierceness of fight that some of these extremist groups have. Is that a fair characterization, or am I jumping to a conclusion?
Well, I'm sorry, I should have, maybe I wasn't so clear. The businessmen are funding the brigade, but what you see is the people that come from abroad, they're much more ideological in the reasons that they fight for. Some of these other units, they were created by criminal gangs. They just were bored and they had nothing to do with the revolution. Came, hey, let's get together and make our criminal gang a rebel brigade, and we can show that we're defending society, and then steal cars under that banner instead.
Right. As I look at Syria, and other people have described this, that any military victory for either side would be a catastrophe for Syria. One side overtaking the other, and the subsequent massacres and things you might expect. With all these groups fighting and fighting each other, with the Pac-Man strategy taking, do any of you, I'll open this up to the entire panel, does anyone think there's a prospect for a political resolution to the civil war?
I certainly don't. I think the increasingly, given the nature of the tactics on both sides, this has now turned into an existential contest for all concerned. That is, among the participants in the conflict, none of them can clearly see a way in which they would survive under a regime that was dominated by another. And there's just an accumulation of too much bloodshed and too many calls for revenge to bring them together. I don't think a political solution is on. That's my
Mr.
view.
Tabler, I saw you looking to answer.
A political solution to put Syria, the country, the Syrian Arab Republic, as it's officially known, back together in the foreseeable future, I think it would be very difficult to achieve. The administration is determined to start that process in talks in Geneva. I think those are now going to take place in January. There was a rumor that they might take place on December 12th. It would be very difficult to achieve those objectives. What I think we will have for the foreseeable future is we will have a de jure Syria on a map, which is the one that's in front of us here. In a de facto sense, it will be divided into those three general areas that I outlined in my presentation. The problem is that the lines of control, the contours of control, will not be clear. It'll be more like a mosaic. The other major problem is, especially among the opposition groups, that in the face of such bloodshed, we expected their elites to congeal, to come together more under a national banner. For a variety of reasons, not just foreign sponsorship, but also some historically, from my own work, some historical proclivities within Syria that occur when people come out of an authoritarian system like that. It gives way to grandiosity among leaders. It's not uncommon among politicians, of course, but only if in the end, present company accepted, but only in the end if it leads to the destruction of a nation. And I think what we're going to have to deal with is a divided Syria for the foreseeable future.
I'm sorry, same amount of time. If you could subsequently maybe touch on the fact, with that as a statement, as a policy guidance, should the United States lean in and try to affect what's happening on the ground in Syria, or should we stand back and try to contain everything within Syria? And I'll yield. Would
you like me? I can answer that
very quickly.
Sure. I think that containing it within Syria is not working. We have to deal with the disease itself. We have to just decide whether that involves the de facto partition of the country and how we deal with it. And then I think that will make it easier to deal with the different threats that I outlined. Trying to put the two sides back together at this point and have kind of a viable solution seems at the moment a pipe dream.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Colonel Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to go back to the issue of chemical weapons. And obviously there's still a number of them in the country and everything, and the danger posed by falling into one of the, I don't know how many groups you've listed, I lost track. I didn't update my scorecard, but the scenarios there are just intriguing and horrific because they would go to any means whatsoever in their employment of it. Do you have any comment on the possibility that that could be a military target of not just the sarin gas, but even more the VX agents?
The chemical weapons are a potential target by all of the parties concerned, simply because they're a prize that will give any one of the units leverage and make them more important players than they are. In other words, if you get your hands on that, you're more important. But also, interestingly, the Assad's agreement to get rid of the chemical weapons, in a certain sense, is a strategy that helps the Assad regime survive, because it is a major logistics enterprise to both protect and to move those weapons and to ultimately dismantle or disarm those weapons. Doing that in the midst of a conflict is very, very difficult to do so. And so there's going to be extreme pressure on the rebel forces to not interfere with the disarmament process. And in other words, it is a way in which we are obliged to accept the legitimacy of the Assad regime and the primacy of the Assad regime and lean on the rebels to allow the disarmament process to take place, because if the conflict continues at its current intensity, it's very, very difficult to get those weapons out of there.
Just to continue on that very quickly, you're talking about some extremist groups. Obviously, they kill people, take the hearts out and organs and eat them, and obviously publicize that, which I think was in the spring of this year. Very, very shocking videos that the ends achieve the means. And sooner or later, they're going to look at that as a weapon of opportunity, and that's why I mentioned that. But going just a little, I don't want to run out of time. The Chechnyan rebels and any connection to the groups there, would this explain partly the Russian role in there, other than its traditional support of the Assad regime or the fear of training Sunni extremists that would go back to Chechnya and blow up parts of Russia?
Not at all. Putin sees this as a Cold War. It's just a game in the Cold War. He doesn't want to let the United States have any more assets in the region. Some people think that it's because of the naval base at Tartus. He doesn't need that naval base. He can't bring frigates in there. He can't have long stays of the sailors in there. This is just a Cold War mentality. He does not want the United States to win.
So you're saying he's not worried about the Chechen rebels and perhaps this ecumenical tie to the ones in this. I had kind of gotten a different impression when I was in Russia that what was going on in Chechnya and North and South Ossetia and everything else, the tremendous fear, almost a purge of any of the extremists, and they would go to any means, including a former terrorist leader that's now in charge of Chechnya.
If he felt like that, then he would support the rebels to try to end the war, because the rebels, the Chechens, the Jaish al-Muhajirin wal Ansar, are part of the radical opposition that came about just in the last 2 years. Early on, you had more nationalist, moderate means.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you. I yield.
The gentleman yields back his time. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. You have another question? I'll recognize the ranking member.
We've seen Assad win some victories on the ground. Are you folks pretty convinced that Assad isn't going to win this thing? Mr. Smith?
Well, these victories that you're actually watching, the recent ones, these are due to these Shia militias and the Iranian involvement.
Well, that's one way to win.
But going back to will he win, we keep continuing this paradigm that one side is going to win over the other, and Syria is a multipolar conflict. I'm actually.
But the Assad family's been able to impose its will on all of Syria for a long time, and they're making a little progress toward returning to that. Are you confident they can't put this Humpty Dumpty back together again?
Frankly, I don't think that they can. A lot of these advancements that they've made, they haven't been able to hold on to certain large tracts of territory.
Does anybody on the panel have a different view? Anybody betting on Assad? Okay. I feel like a croupier. Lebanon is an analogy here, but Lebanon went through a violent phase of its kaleidoscope on a less violent stage. Now it's being affected by Syria. Could we see we saw some peace in Lebanon 5 years ago, 10 years ago, in spite of the fact that you didn't have one government in control equally of all the territory. You had different groups in control with their own militias. Sounds like a peaceful version of today's Syria. But one difference is in Lebanon, whatever group lived in an area had control of the area. There was a certain fairness to their allocation of the territory. In Syria, the Alawites are 15% and have traditionally held the whole country, and today hold a big chunk of it. Can there be, what should I say, less violent stasis in Syria, some sort of acceptance of a militia-controlled status quo in different regions? Or does the fact that the Alawites want over half the pie and, quote, deserve only 15% mean that they have to keep fighting until it's over? Mr. Jenkins.
First of all, in sorting things out in Lebanon, the civil war went on for 15 years.
Mhm.
So if we get into 2-3 decades, we can, different scenarios open up after people exhaust themselves. And second, the fighting in Lebanon, while it was intense, did not achieve the intensity that the fighting in Syria has, nor did it produce the kind of displacement in terms of refugees and so on. And so while it is possible, I think, that we will see consolidation of these enclaves, and that could lead to some sort of a stasis, there will continue to be pushing and shoving around the edges. But that may turn out to be, in a sense, of a spectrum of poor outcomes. That one may be one of the least poor, that is, accepting the de facto partition of Syria into a kaleidoscope of enclaves and attempting to simply reduce both the internal violence and the potential spillover in terms of international terrorism that would create.
All right, I have another question. One last question. While this is taking place, all these countries that surround Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, are we going to see an influx into those countries of the groups that are in Syria, whether they're on the Assad side or whether they're on the rebel side? Are they these militias going to move into these other countries?
I will speak for the Assad side. The Shia militia organizations are already based in Iraq. They already have political influence there. Lebanese Hezbollah is, a very, very big player in Lebanon, and essentially run the show in most cases.
Iranians want to take over the whole region.
Well, of course they do. I mean,
And eliminate Israel in the process.
well, that's one of the cores of their ideological structure.
Okay, what about the other
State
side?
al-Zaghir,
What
small
about the
state.
folks fighting on the rebel side? Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Okay, well,
Scarfy, I'll let you answer that last
let's just take a look
question.
at Jordan. We know hundreds of Jordanians have gone. Some get caught, some end up dead, and some are still there. This is the Zarqawi network. These are the same Salafi leaders that plowed people in, piped people into Iraq. They're now coming back. Look at Lebanon. This is one of the biggest bombings we've seen in years in Lebanon of the Iranian embassy. I mean, you're already seeing this blowback, and we know there's a lot of Salafis. We know there's jihadists in Lebanon. They were there before, but you're getting now the blowback. And what are they going to do? And they're going to take the war to the infidel Shia Hezbollah there. And in Jordan, they might try to destabilize the regime. It's very, very bad, this blowback and spillover.
I want to thank all of y'all. Your testimony was excellent. Your written statements were excellent. So without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements. There may be more questions that we'd like for you to answer in writing, and extraneous materials for the record subject to the limitation in the rules. Thank you once again. Committee's adjourned.